Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Conversations with me, Jason Greenwood. And look, I wanted to catch up with Nigel Poole from Matter Design out of Australia for a chat today. How you going, Nigel?
Good, Jason. How about yourself?
Mate, doing really well. It's a sunny day here in Auckland after a couple of weeks of nearly solid rain, so I'm happy to see the sunshine. How about you guys?
Same in Sydney. It's a very rare occurrence right now. So yeah, we're enjoying it too.
Nice one. Look, I wanted to have this conversation, and I think you probably did too, because we've been able to work on some work together recently, jointly, some joint projects together that, from my perspective, have been incredibly fulfilling. I've learned a ton. I have been able to work on some super interesting stuff that's super challenging. It's not vanilla, basic, off the shelf e-commerce in any stretch of the imagination. And I know that you guys and your team have enjoyed working on these projects as well. And I really wanted to take us into the direction of trying to surface some of our learnings of working together to other people in the industry, merchants, etc., that may want to look at taking on an agency like you guys, an e-commerce development agency and team and partner, but also maybe looking to take on a consultant, or maybe their agency is recommending they go talk to a consultant first, or they're working with a consultant who's helping them to find an agency. So we've got merchants that find themselves in this gray middle sometimes of, hey, do I need to go work with an agency, or do I need to go work with a consultant, or do I need to work with both? And when would that happen? And that's such a hard thing, I think, for merchants to decide. And I think hopefully some of our experiences working together will be beneficial.
Yeah, I think like some of this work is, as you say, super challenging for you and I who do this day in, day out. And for the merchant themselves, like how are they meant to do it? Like how do they know what they don't know and what they need to know to tell an agency to brief them properly? So I guess what we've seen with this experience is that having a good relationship with a consultant and an agency can really assist the merchant figure out what they're actually trying to do and how to go about it. And it's not a skill set that every merchant has in-house. And so when they're at that point where they know they've got to do something with their e-commerce, they know what they want to do, but how to go about it is a really challenging prospect for. So I think what I've seen is your style and your ability to help them cut through all that clutter of sales pitches and different technologies and just different kind of ideas that they need to distill and understand like what is important to them and their business is best done by a consultant, much better than an agency advising them, because there's that sense of an in-house kind of consultant helping them, not being sold to, being advised. And I think that's a really important asset for them at that time when they're just trying to figure stuff out.
And on the flip side, I would say that because consultants, or at least most consultants, and certainly for myself, because we don't do the actual implementation, that's where we need to be able to trust the agency partnerships and colleagues that we have in the industry to hand these types of projects off to. Now, it doesn't mean it's not like a hot potato. We just chuck it to you and go, now that's your baby now, and we don't have anything to do with it. We, at least speaking for myself, I will always stay involved as long as the client wants me to stay involved. I'll hold hands. I'll help to reset expectations with them. If their scope changes on their side, I'll hopefully help, set and maintain reasonable budget expectations for them of what they want to achieve based on my knowledge of working in the industry as an agency. And so I think it feels very much there's a hand-holding process from both sides. And in a perfect world with a perfect outcome, agency and consultant are actually on the same team, which ultimately means on the team of the client. So we're both working on behalf of the client for a great outcome. And I think what you said is so true. Sometimes merchants just don't know what they don't know. And so therefore, if they go too early to an agency and they get into discovery straight away with an agency, if half of the responses to the questions the agency asks are, I don't know, you're the expert, don't know the answers to this, then we've probably got a problem. And it's probably a time for them to bring in a consultant and help them even be able to figure out how to arrive at their requirements in the first place.
100%. And I guess one example that we're both working on, we've been speaking to them for several years, and they, I guess, with renewed energy in the last year, wanted to go ahead with the re-platform and engage an agency, but still like actually getting a clear sense of requirements was very difficult, and getting you introduced to them and then like for you to be able to build that relationship with them and really get inside their business in a way that is maybe not what an agency needs to build that knowledge as well, but for a consultant to be able to go in there and have conversations with them that they're not necessarily going to have with an agency up front, and to actually figure out what they're trying to achieve, I think was a really, like, that was the critical point for them to actually be able to then form a project that we were able to pitch on and that they were able to fortunately accept and go ahead with. But until that point, it was very difficult for us to actually work out what they were actually trying to achieve.
Yeah, and I think also you raise a really good point. So my experience in agency land is that until a project really gets into the hands of the developers, which is the engine room of the business, that's not really a profitable project up until that point. Because typically, particularly in an e-commerce agency, if we look at the total, let's say an agency that has 100 staff, they might have 75 developers, they might have 10 strategists or consultants, they might have some AMs, some PMs, and then obviously an owner or a founder like yourself. So the lion's share of the team in an e-commerce agency is usually the development team, which is the kind of the engine room of the business. So until we can get the client moved from, hey, I think we might want to replatform or do this piece of work, to hey, it's in the developer's hands to actually start delivering that work, that the longer that beginning process takes, the harder it is for an agency to become sustainable, because that's not where they're heavily resourced. They're not super heavily resourced in that front end. They're more heavily resourced on the development side. So if we can help move the process along through strategic consulting up front, that doesn't take up your team's time up front, and we can get a really clear scope of work before we ever get to you, then that means we can get the project into a state of development so much faster.
Yeah. And what I've really appreciated working with you, like your style, is you have a very good idea of how things can be achieved, not just like what needs to be achieved, but how that can actually be done, and where the complexity is, and where that might push out a budget or push out a time frame or just be a blocker because the data isn't correct or whatever that might be. You've got a very good sense for what that is, how that's actually going to be achieved as a solution. From our side, like whilst we do often the solutioning at our end, we could see you had a very clear kind of solution in mind when you wrote the business requirements document. So it was very easy for us to understand how you were thinking would be best to go about it, which we were aligned with as well, which is great. And yeah, that way, I think when you're writing those requirements for the client, it's achievable. It's something that they can have expectations on without kind of just wanting things that are very difficult or expensive to achieve, or just not achievable within their business. It's actually a requirement that can actually something that the agency can understand can be achieved. So I found that really useful, the way you structured your requirements document, to then be able to put our proposal together on.
And on the flip side, I've really enjoyed the relationship we've been able to forge through some of those really complex scenarios where maybe the architecture was from a high level pretty clear, but there was some individual components that maybe there was some question marks around about the best way to approach this. And we've been able to collaborate beyond and into the deep solutioning phase with the specifics of the solution or the specifics of integration. We've been able to collaborate on that kind of dotting the I's, crossing the T's, getting to an exact final specification of the project. We've been able to continue to collaborate well beyond the initial requirements phase to make sure that we both agree, hey, this is achievable. This ultimately delivers what the client expects and wants out of this project, and is going to end up with a really great result for them that will scale long into the post-live experience. This is a scalable solution. Hey, we've defined this MVP, this minimum viable product, to get us live, but we've got this roadmap of work that we already know is in mind. The client already has it in mind. So we know post-live, there's going to be a long stream of enhancements that are going to need to happen, but we haven't hamstrung ourselves in the initial build to make that harder on the backside.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, I found that when there's those kind of challenging pieces in the architecture that need to be worked out, we've actually had a very clear kind of definition around that. What is the problem? So we can really focus on how we can solve it. Sometimes the problem isn't clear or apparent because there's too much cloud around it. But I found with this, we've been able to really hone in on where's the issue, what are our options, how can we solve it best, and yeah, between us get a good outcome. And that's been us working together, but then also with third parties, working with them to work through the problem collaboratively with them. And I found it to be a really good process, having being able to work with you, because it means that we're not doing all that kind of heavy lifting ourselves, but we can play a really important role still on helping problem solve and helping solution the system. It's worked like really good, really well from our side, because we know we've got someone sort of client side, and we see you client side that is holding their hand along the way and making them feel comfortable and confident with what's going on. And so there's not this sort of, it's not two sides to it. It's the consultant can really bring both sides together.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you see me as an ally just as much as they see me as an ally. I'm not here to make your life a living hell as an agency. I've worked agency, so I have a total appreciation and respect for what you guys do and how difficult it can be at times. But I'm here to kind of keep everyone honest, so to speak, meaning the client, if they commit to a scope of work and they commit to a set of requirements and they commit to a budget, etc., that I make sure and try to keep that in a reasonably confined box so that we don't have endless scope creep that no one is expecting.
Yeah.
And by the same token, it's my job on behalf of the client to try to hold the agency accountable, such as you guys, for delivery, for what you've committed to, for the timelines you've committed to, and for the aspects of the project that you've said, hey, we're going to own those pieces. And so I feel like I'm trying to always, in what I do, is to try to I think of it almost greasing the wheels of the project. It's how can I keep the project moving in a positive direction for both merchant and agency, because I have to really be impartial in my view of the overall project with the outcome in mind.
Yeah, totally. And I think there's been like one case where we were like working out what was the best PIM to put in place, and we both had our own experience with different technologies that we were bringing to the table. We were both putting it on the table for the client and went through the process, and I think that was like a really healthy outcome for the client, because we're going to, I guess, back what we know, because that's what we can't really back something we don't know. But you
Yeah.
had experience with a technology that we weren't familiar with. And I guess that process meant that the merchant had two points of view, two ways to do it, and they could decide the best way. And if you weren't involved, your solution wouldn't have been on the table for them. We would have been going ahead with another option. But yeah, I thought that there's some really healthy kind of points of view that can be different, but still get a good outcome for the merchant at the end of the day, which is, I think, what we've been able to do is keep that they are the sort of key party here. Getting the best result for them is what we're all trying to achieve. And we haven't been too sort of strong on what we want in the system. Like, we've been open to another point of view and whatever's best for the client at the end of the day. I think I can see that's worked really well, and I can see the trust that they've got in you as a result. And I think them in us as well, because we work that way.
Yeah, and I think we haven't stepped on each other's toes, and I think that's an important part of the relationship that has meant that we can work together with huge amounts of trust and respect for each other. I have massive respect for what you guys do, because I know how bloody hard it is, and you have knowledge, talent, and experience that is very hard fought, and I bring a slightly different element to the table because of my suite of experience. And so what I've enjoyed is exactly what you're referring to, is that ultimately we want a solution that's going to work for the client, and they are the North Star. The client is the North Star. A great outcome for them is both of our North Stars. Otherwise, we don't exist. If the client isn't happy, we don't exist anymore. Yeah. They don't have any need for us, either of us. And so I think we're very conscious of that. And in regards to the PIM specifically, I think we both knew straight away, just by looking at the outcomes that they were wanting to achieve, the one thing we could agree on, they had to have a PIM. They had to have that. And we had a pretty clear understanding and agreement on the data structures that needed to be in place to achieve the outcomes that they wanted. And we knew that organizing that inside of a PIM was going to be critical to getting the outcome that they wanted. So ultimately, which PIM they chose was irrelevant to us, so long as they picked a solution that would work for them, would work for their business processes, and could organize the data in the way that we knew it had to be organized to create the end consumer experience that they told us they wanted to create.
Yeah, and I think how they use that technology is something that you're really close to as well as the consultant, like something that we would not typically get as close as you do. And I know that you work very closely with them on the training and on the adoption of the technology and how they go about that and what they're trying to achieve. And I think that again is a really important skill set that they've got now in their team with bringing you on board, and something that they would otherwise be trying to figure out with the technology. But the technology is a tool, and you're advising on why we're using this tool. And I think that's what's unique about your point of view, and it's a point of view that they wouldn't necessarily get from just working with the technology, because they're going to train them on the tech, but not the reason for using the tech so much. So I think that's something that I can see them maintaining that engagement with you for a long time, because it is so helpful to have that. And I think the way you structure things with them is very achievable for a merchant to bring you on board and work with you. I can see you've done a good job at that style of engagement.
Thank you. And look, I think if we switch gears for a moment now, I've been on the receiving end of some really challenging consultants. Like when I was working agency side, I'll be honest, I've worked with some consultants that were absolutely incredible and just made a project so much easier. But then I've had some consultants who, on the flip side, maybe created additional stumbling blocks or created additional challenges or felt like they knew more than the entire agency knew, or had some very clear outcomes, or maybe perhaps even an agenda of their own that they were looking to get out of a project versus looking at the best outcome for the client. So I'm sure that you've probably come across consultants in the same vein. So what are some of the red flags that you've seen with some consultants that can make your job really difficult and can lead to really challenging outcomes for the client? Because I know I've definitely experienced that at times before.
Yeah, I think what can be like we've talked a bit about what works well. What doesn't work well is when there's this there's not that respect between the consultant and agency, and it becomes maybe adversarial is too strong a word, but it's you're not kind of
Our struggle, right?
dream team. And so if the agency feels like the consultant isn't helping us get a result here, and that's not about reducing the scope or reducing the accountability that the agency has, but it's making the job harder, is then can, I guess, erode that trust and that kind of collaborative relationship that can be there. And I think at the end of the day, it's like when a consultant can play that middle ground of helping both parties, merchant and agency, then they're building a sort of environment of trust with the whole team. And unless that trust is there, it starts to, like, people start to ask questions, and it then can be a sort of more negative kind of view on the whole project. But I think that's what's most important, that there's respect between the different parties. We're all trying to achieve an outcome that's good for everyone, and not at the expense of anyone in particular. Yeah, I think that it's like the style of consulting. Some consultants will be very much on the merchant's kind of side, and it will be and we won't always get the sort of support that we get with, like, working with you in that sort of more collaborative style, and that's fine. Like, we'll still get through it. But I guess what we see work well is where it's, if the client's wanting something, you're able to manage their expectations on what that actually means and what they are actually asking of the agency by wanting that. And not all consultants will go there. They'll go, okay, we'll get the agency to do it, and it's their problem to solve. Whereas I feel that I see you already solving the problem in a way, like in your head, that's going to be a problem for someone.
And I might as well take the heat now, because otherwise we're going to all be taking the heat later.
Yeah, exactly. And which can lead to a tougher relationship between agency and merchant if there's expectations that are skewed off what's realistic.
And what would your advice be for, let's say there's a merchant that's engaged with a consultant today, and they're about ready to, or they've just engaged with an agency, and they sense that there is friction? Because I have seen this before, where friction emerges, and if you don't deal with that friction between the consultant and the agency and nip that in the bud pretty early, it can grind a project to a halt, basically.
Yeah.
And what would your advice be for merchants that might find themselves in that situation today, where they are working with a consultant and looking to take on an agency, or they're in that situation already where there's extreme friction between those two, and hey, if we don't nip this in the bud, it is going to hurt all of us, and we're not actually, we might even have a failed project over it?
Yeah, it's the merchant is paying the money, and it's their call. If they want to, I don't think they should be entering into a commercial arrangement where they know that there is friction that's not going to help them at the end of the day. So I think in that case, they need to make a choice whether they want to work with the agency or the consultant ongoing. And for, let's say it's the agency they want to work with, maybe the agency can recommend a consultant that they think would be a good fit, and that they can then do a consultant selection to sort of transition. But if a consultant is very embedded and doing a great job, like, they should choose an agency that works well with that consultant, because otherwise they're going to get a tricky situation that isn't their problem. They should be hiring people that are going to be able to work for them. And if there's a bad relationship between them, then I just don't think they should go there.
I couldn't agree more. Now, one of the other things that I think you've handled particularly well is an evolving expectation by the client around what the engagement model with you might look like. So, for example, if in this particular case we're discussing, you recommended the client come and talk to me because they were at a bit of a crossroads and they needed to make some key decisions before they could move forward with any agency, let alone you. And so I was able to get them to a place where they felt confident enough to move forward with an agency. But they gave me a very clear mandate that they didn't want to just by default, because they had already been talking to you before they met me, to just hand the project over to you. They wanted to get some proposals so that they could compare as bit to the best of their ability, apples to apples, to make sure they were getting a good experience and that they were getting the right fit for an agency. And I have tremendous respect for you in that you didn't get upset or shitty or angry or frustrated over that. Many agencies would have the absolute natural expectation that if you hand a project over or a client over to a consultant, that when they're finished consulting with them, they hand them straight back to you, and that there's no other agency potentially even involved. But it's not usually up to us as the consultant. It's up to the client. And if the client says, we want to get proposals from more than one agency so that we can see what those look like, so that we can make a fully informed decision, it's up to us as the consultants to do what they ask. And it puts us sometimes in a very awkward position. If an agency has sent a client to us, it puts us in a very awkward position to have that conversation back and say, hey, the client wants to go to market for this. And so I have complete respect for you and the professionalism that you handled this exact situation with recently. You handled it with total professionalism, and it was like, hey, you have to do what the client wants at the end of the day.
Yeah, we took a risk there, because I knew introducing you in meant that we weren't going to be the ones to necessarily be able to win the client at that point. But I guess what I could see was the client needed that help to actually get to a decision and be able to, I guess we took the risk to make the project happen, introducing you in. And I guess when it came to selecting the agency, we were aware that we were going to potentially be in a competitive bid by doing that. And for us, when it came about that it was going to be competitive, for us, it was like, if we're going to win it, we need to win it on merit anyway. We don't want to have the client feel obligated to choose us. We want them to choose us for what we can offer. And we don't want to start a relationship based on that sort of them feeling forced into just going with us. We would much rather go into a competitive situation, pitch based on what we think is best, and have them convinced of that and go with us for that reason, because then there's no question of why we're all working together. So it's maybe, more a risky path, but it's a better path for an agency to have that trust of the client up front. Yeah, I think it's the best outcome. Definitely glad it went our way, of course. Maybe I'd have a different view if it didn't, but no, I think it was still a good process for the client. At the end of the day, they felt like they were in control of all those decisions, and that's much better for everyone.
Totally agree. I think we as consultants, we are the meat in the sandwich sometimes, and it does put us in a very awkward position when we've got great working relationships with more than one agency, just like you have to have great working relationships with more than one consultant. And so you wouldn't necessarily recommend me for all engagements, because you might think that someone else is a better fit. And so I would never have the default expectation that every consulting engagement would go to me from you, for example. And I guess you have the reasonable expectation that not every deal is going to fall your way. So I think if we're all reasonable and we all understand that we won't make a perfect fit for every client and every engagement, but if we have good intent and we want great outcomes for the client, that we're going to win our fair share of work in the market in an open, competitive environment, because we're good at what we do, and we will be a great fit for a certain percentage of the market. And if we can just win those deals that we're a great fit for, we will have very sustainable, very happy businesses, and ultimately happy employees and happy clients, which is ultimately the measure of success.
Yeah, and I think people, it's good when they find the agency that is the right fit, because otherwise that means the agency is focusing on work that they are really good at, and that it is a good fit for them, and they're progressing their skills in that, doing that style of work. And sometimes we lose a deal and it's actually we probably weren't the right fit on reflection, and that means that we've opened up capacity to do this other project that might have come along that is a better fit. Yeah, I think doesn't always go the way of an agency, but as long as it's going the right way for the merchant, then that's a better outcome.
Couldn't agree more. Any final tips as we come to the close of our time together? Any last tips that you would have for merchants that are either maybe on the fence about taking on an agency, or on the fence about how to take on an agency, or how to select an agency, or how to select a consultant, and whether they even need a consultant? Any sort of final parting tips for merchants that find themselves in that questioning phase of who do we engage with? Why should we engage with them? What kind of outcome should we expect?
Yeah, I think engaging an agency or a consultant, you're essentially like bringing someone on board or a team on board that you're going to be working a lot with. So you want to be bringing people on that you enjoy working with. You don't want to be paying money to someone that, or a company that's just going to make your life harder. It's got to be in your favor. I'd say I see a lot of sort of talking to technologies and then finding agencies through that. And I think that's a valid process. But I'd encourage merchants to meet with agencies and meet with consultants and just get a feel for how they approach things, because I think there's a lot of value that both agency and consultant can provide to help them figure out what they're needing. And I think that it might be they might meet with an agency and get a feel for maybe their skill set and what gaps they might have. And an agency might be able to recommend a consultant in that case if they're not ready to engage an agency. So I think you want to bring the agency on board when you can really hit the ground running. And I think if you're still trying to figure stuff out, like that's where a consultant can be really good. They've been there, they've done that, they can really see where the gaps are and help them fill that and get to the point that an agency can be brought on and add a lot of value. And I think a consultant is it's a lower cost to them up front. So it's a better way for them to get that level of confidence to then pick the right agency. Yeah, but I'd recommend merchants, like I'm always very happy to talk to prospects, even if we don't go ahead with them or they don't go ahead with us. It's like always valuable to share some knowledge and see where it goes, and connect people with other people if that's a better outcome for them.
I'm going to ask you a very polarizing last question, and then I'm going to give my thoughts on the answer to this after you give yours. Thoughts on RFPs?
I like them. I like the process of seeing what needs to be done and figuring out a solution. That's the sort of, I like problem solving. I like kind of solutioning. So I enjoy that. They're, I think, necessary. I think they're for a merchant to really see who wants the business the most as well, and who is willing to really go hard on the RFP. Gives them a lot of confidence. They're time consuming, but I guess we're set up to be able to participate and have a good crack at them and not go half-hearted. So I think I'm not shy about them.
Fair enough. Well, look, I hold totally a different view. And my view has always been there's only two people that win in an RFP: the one who wins the deal and the one who never responds to the RFP.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily think that. So my experience with RFPs has been that the merchant will oftentimes go down the RFP path because, say, a consultant has told them you need to go down the RFP path to get the best deal you can get. And oftentimes they also position an RFP process as the best way to get to a proposal that is an apples to apples comparison. And there just isn't. I don't think there's any RFP process on earth that will get you to a place where you can, at face value, take 5 proposals, for example, and line them up side by side and say, now, because we define the RFP and how they're going to be responded to, now we can say that these 5, we can compare them side by side on an apples to apples basis. There's just too much involved in that. And I think what it does is the RFP runs the very big risk of sterilizing the process to the point where it takes out the piece of, can I work with these people? Do I like these people? Would I like to have a long-term relationship with them? I might want to date them, but would I want to marry them, kind of thing? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so I think that the RFP process can be good if it brings in elements of that personality and relationship fit as well. But my experience with RFPs hasn't usually been that way. It tries to sterilize the process and try to separate out the proposal from the humans who provided the proposal in the first place. And for me, that feels like a massive loss for the merchant, because that's such a critical part of the decision-making process.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely some RFP sort of structures that can be like that, where it is sterilized. And the thing that I find hard on an RFP process is knowing what's more important to the client than out of all those requirements. Where is the focus? Where's the kind of, what is it that they really want? And I find that best comes out of good workshops and discussions, because you can really hone in on what's the best focus for the system. And it could be that some things are very complicated to achieve, but it's just one thing that maybe isn't so important. So sometimes that can be not really apparent in an RFP. And sometimes we've been involved in some where it hasn't gone our way, and the reason it's gone another way is something that wasn't really what they were asking for up front. And it can be a bit hard to take when it's like that, when you do invest so much into it and they make a choice on a decision on an aspect that wasn't really put forward as being the main decision-making criteria. That can be tricky, but yeah, look, I think it's just all like a different style of consulting to run an RFP in that way. Yeah, at the end of the day, you've got to work with people and you've got to have people that are committed to delivering an outcome, and that's our style. So we do better when we are actually able to engage with a client in a conversation and a workshop and help them get confident in our ability to work through problems. And yeah, we've seen that work well for us.
Yeah, look, it can go both ways, and I agree with you. I think sometimes an RFP can have two sort of pieces to it that don't necessarily work in an agency's favor. One of those is that sometimes an RFP is done simply because they're forced to by a board, for example. They wouldn't necessarily go an RFP, and they might even have a predetermined winner in mind, but they're forced to go out and get some competitive quotes. They run a formal RFP process, even though they know who they're ultimately going to choose at the end anyway. That's one outcome that I've seen many times before. The second one is the consultant might say, here's a great way to get a whole bunch of free consulting, free discovery, free scoping. Let's put the RFP out there to 5 agencies. Let's see what they come back with, solution architecture and recommendations and bits and pieces. And then if we see a consensus among those 5, it's probably the way we should be going, regardless of who we go with. And so those are two outcomes, almost predetermined outcomes before you ever get into the RFP process. You might even learn about it after the fact. And so I would say if a merchant wants great outcomes in an RFP, don't go in with a predetermined winner. Don't go in with a predetermined expectation, and be prepared to at least pay something for someone to respond to an RFP. Don't expect them to do full discovery for free. Don't expect them to do full solution architecture for free, because that is just unrealistic and it's unfair.
Yeah.
That would be my recommendation.
Yeah, look, I agree. Like we'd much prefer to be paid for that process and paid for our time and actually be able to put forward ideas that are valued in that way. But yeah, we recognize it doesn't always go that way. It's not a perfect world, but we'll do whatever we need to get the business. Yeah. But
It's a
I think
necessary evil in our industry. You're never going to get away from it.
exactly.
So we embrace it and we run with it. And look, if a client of mine wants to run an RFP process and they want me to manage it, then by all means, I'm prepared to do that. I try to use something like the Moscow methodology or something like
Yeah.
that, to
Yeah.
your point, so that it's really clear to the people receiving the RFP what the prioritization of specific functionality or specific outcomes are. I think in an RFP scenario like that, if you use a really rigorous methodology of putting together the RFP and really prioritizing using something like the Moscow method, or there's many other methods you could use, I think then you can set yourself up for a better outcome from an RFP, as opposed to, here's our list of requirements, tell us what you want to do.
Yeah. And what we're doing as an agency is being able to respond to an RFP and give a solution that achieves all of those requirements and talk to those priorities and select technology that's going to be the best fit as well. So we're really about that end customer experience. How can we achieve what we're trying to achieve from the experience point of view? And what tools do we need to do that? So we've got options for the tools so that we can make recommendations irrespective of focus on their requirements, not going technology first, more going customer experience first. So we found that to be a much better conversation with the merchant, because that's what they're trying to achieve at the end of the day. And we know the technologies, we know what can do what, and we can bring in the tools that do it. But at the end of the day, we're trying to achieve a great experience for the merchant and their customer, and and them as a company managing that system. Our focus is much more customer experience focused these days than the underlying technology, because we know how to achieve it, and we find that a much better conversation with the merchants these days.
Love it. Nigel, Poole from Matter Design in Australia. Look, it's been awesome chatting with you. I'd recommend anybody who's looking for a quality e-commerce agency partner, reach out to Nigel over at Matter. They're a cool team. They're great people to work with. They know their stuff. I've really enjoyed working with you on the projects we've been working on together. And look, I really appreciate the insights from your side of the table that I think is, this information is something that I don't think get talked about enough in our industry. These kind of conversations, these really opening the kimono kind of conversations from inside our industry. This is the kind of some of the dirty stuff that doesn't get talked about, or the messy stuff is a better term, that doesn't get talked about enough. And unless you've got somebody on your team that has navigated these waters before, it's really hard for merchants to make some of these decisions. So thank you for sharing your wisdom. Thank you for sharing your experience. And I continue to wish you guys over at Matter all the best, because you guys deserve it. You got some great intent and you guys are doing good work.
Thanks, Jason. Always a pleasure to chat, and it's been great working with you on projects as well. I look forward to more.
Look forward to it, mate. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Okay, cheers.